Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk about the European energy market. If you've been following the channel, you'll be fully aware that the price of coal and gas and other energy products has skyrocketed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that's causing a lot of pain all across the continent. And the majority of the discussions that we've had on the channel have focused in on the costs for consumers. The fact that everybody is now going to have to pay more for all of their energy. And that's causing pain in every single country in Europe. But in today's episode, I want to look at the infrastructure of the energy industry, because the energy industry employs millions of people in Europe. And because a lot of countries have deregulated their energy provision, lots and lots of smaller companies are involved in the supply chain. And because of that, we've now got a complex financial structure. There are lots of derivative products, and a lot of companies are lending in order to keep their supplies going. And we've just seen a statement from one of the big Norwegian companies, Equinor, and one of their executives has come out and stated that he believes that the energy market needs around $1.5 trillion worth of support in order to ensure that it doesn't fail. And Equinor have based that $1.5 trillion figure on margin calls. And a margin call relates to a situation where a company is being provided with some form of energy and has to place money on deposit with its supplier in order to cover any future movements in prices. And of course, what we've seen over the last 6 months or so is a massive movement in prices. So that's meant that the margin calls are increasing, and that's placing further demand and pressure on all of these companies. And we're getting to the point now where we don't know whether or not all these companies are going to survive. So in today's episode, we'll have a look at how the industry is structured. We'll talk about the supply chain of energy from the production right through to the consumers and have a look at which companies are involved. We'll talk about margin calls in a bit more detail. So I'll go through how that works to give you a full understanding of it. We'll then have a look at what's been happening with regards to the raw material prices, which is obviously fed through into energy prices and therefore is increasing the risk and the margin calls for all the companies involved. I'll go on to talk about the impact of all of this on the energy sector. A lot of companies have already gone bust, and there are very many more who are on the verge of going bankrupt. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of all of this are for Europe and the global economy. So before we get started on all of that, if I could ask you to give me a thumbs up at some point during this video if you're enjoying the content. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I always include chapters so you can skip through things if you don't have time to watch the whole video. And if you'd like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to YouTube's Super Thanks and membership, as well as Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. When the energy markets were first established, most of the operators were nationally owned enterprises. So these were national companies that reported directly to the government, and all the employees were therefore employed directly by the state. But over the last 50 years or so, we've seen a high degree of deregulation all across Europe. So in many countries, the national entities were broken up. They were divided into the different parts of the industry. So the producers of gas and electricity, the distributors, the networks, and the billing companies were all separated into different companies. And as the markets became deregulated, lots of small enterprises came into the market in order to offer more competition and better deals for consumers. So this is a classic case of breaking up a monopoly situation to try to get a better deal for everybody in the end. And on the whole, the concept of deregulation has been quite successful. There have been lots and lots of small businesses that have grown up. But what we have seen is that some of the larger entities, so the more attractive assets, have been taken over by foreign entities. And that then tends to cause a little bit of disharmony in each country, because when they see these businesses making large profits, then that causes concern amongst consumers. And that's the situation that we've got right now. Electricity and gas prices have gone sky high since the start of the Ukraine war. And a lot of consumers are now very unhappy when they see these large multinational enterprises declaring record profits at the same time as the household bills are going through the roof. So we're now getting to a situation where governments in a lot of countries in Europe are thinking about stepping in, either to provide subsidies directly to the consumers to keep the bills down, or potentially applying large windfall taxes against some of these big companies in order to fund the subsidies that they need to give to the consumers. Now, the provision of electricity and gas is big business. We're talking large volumes. And the financials behind that are also very large. And in order for the smaller players to be able to enter the market and provide competition, complex financial structures have been set up within the industry to enable small players to be able to purchase small amounts of gas and electricity. So in order to get a better understanding of how the industry is structured and how all these financials fit together, let's have a look at the supply chain. This graphic provides a simplified explanation as to how a deregulated market works for energy production. So at the very top here, we've got the generators. So these are the companies that are generating electricity. And in order to do that, obviously, there is a massive amount of capital investment needed. You need to set up huge plants that are either producing electricity from coal or gas or hydro or solar or nuclear or some other form of power generation. So these companies tend to be very large entities. And in most situations, these companies are national, so they will have power generation plants all across the country that they're located in. So it's likely that they will have multiple power stations and potentially also different forms of power generation within their portfolio. So these are the guys at the very top of the tree. These are the kings of the castle. They are producing the electricity that everybody needs. Now, once that electricity is produced, the generator has two options. It can either supply consumers directly, or it can sell that electricity in the wholesale market. In a truly deregulated market, the vast majority of the electricity produced will go into the wholesale market. And that market is sophisticated, and this is where the financials start coming in. Because the market will set wholesale rates, and the generators will sign wholesale contracts with a lot of different entities who want to buy large quantities from them. So in this chart, the next level of businesses are called retailers. And basically what these are smaller companies who want to offer electricity to the consumer market, to the retail market. Now, these companies are not generating the electricity, but what they're doing is providing billing services. So they will offer deals to the market and they will sign deals with consumers, and those consumers will be supplied with electricity. Now, as I mentioned, this is a very simplified model, so it doesn't show the distribution and transmission companies. But what you have in the industry is companies who are actually employed to get the electricity directly from the generators to the consumers. So they're the businesses that own all the power cable networks and all of the infrastructure that's in place that allows electricity to go to consumers' houses and to industry. The retailers on this chart aren't involved in any transmission or distribution. What they're doing is signing agreements to notionally purchase an amount of electricity from the generator, and then they will bill the consumer, and then they pay the generator once they've received the money from the consumers. So the retailers in this scenario, the small businesses, the enterprises who are involved in the deregulation, are really only involved in paper billing transmission. They don't actually touch any of the electricity. They don't own any of the network. They officially become the energy provider to those consumers, but actually they're not involved in any of the production or the distribution. So what we've just seen from the structure of the industry is that a lot of the smaller enterprises, the billing companies who have a direct relationship with consumers, are really just financial institutions. What those companies do is sign a contract to notionally take electricity supply directly from the generators, and then they sign another contract with the consumer, sometimes on a fixed basis, so you'll have a fixed price for your electricity for a certain period of time, sometimes on a floating basis. But they sign deals with the consumers. Those consumers are then provided with electricity directly by the generators and the distribution companies. So the billing entity doesn't get involved in any actual transmission of electricity. And then when the electricity meters are read, the billing company will send a bill to the consumer. The consumer then pays the billing company. And the billing company then has to settle all of its outstanding obligations with the generator. And this is where the financial structure of the whole market starts coming together. The generators of electricity are generating massive amounts of power, and contracts to purchase that power are sold into the wholesale market. And those contracts are then broken down into smaller contracts and smaller contracts in order to get to a manageable size for the billing companies. So this is what's known as a derivatives market. People are purchasing in the global wholesale markets, and they may be purchasing on forward contracts. So you may say, I want the provision of electricity for the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. And you can either agree fixed price deals, which set the price for those periods, or you can buy what's known as the spot market. And the spot market basically is buying at today's price. So if you're looking at the risk profile of these businesses, obviously the best option would be to buy at the fixed price for a set period of time, because then you know exactly what your supply price is. And then you can back to back that contract with the contracts that you sign with the retailers. So if you offer a fixed price deal to all of your customers and you know exactly what the purchase price has been, you've got a guaranteed profit. So that's how a contract would work in a perfect scenario. However, the problem that a lot of these medium and small sized enterprises have is that they don't have enough cash. They simply can't buy that fixed price deal because it has to be paid for upfront. So if you don't have enough capital in order to buy that, then you may decide that you want to just take a view on what the spot price is. And that's what a lot of companies have been doing over the last couple of years. So they've been offering deals to consumers, sometimes on a fixed price deal basis. So they're locking in all of their consumer prices, but they're then buying in the open market. And of course, what's happened over the last 6 months or so since Russia invaded Ukraine is that the spot price market has taken off. The wholesale price of gas and electric has jumped dramatically, and that has led to a massive amount of bankruptcies in the sector, because you've got all of these companies who've got fixed price deals at lower levels, at the historic lower prices that everybody was operating at, and all of a sudden the wholesale prices have doubled overnight, and that's put all of these companies out of business because they're now making losses on all of the contracts because they've got a fixed amount of income coming in, but they've got a variable cost, and that cost has increased dramatically. So that's why we've seen a lot of companies go down in a number of different countries. It's been well documented in the UK that most of the small companies have disappeared over the last 12 months. We have seen a myriad of bankruptcies and liquidations, and a lot of the bigger companies have had to step in and take over those customers because obviously people need to keep being supplied with electricity. So if your supplier, your billing company goes bankrupt, somebody else will then take over that billing. But what happens for the consumers is that any fixed price deal that they had in place is immediately cancelled and they move onto the latest market rates. And that's why we've seen a massive increase in prices for consumers, because all the good deals in the market have disappeared because they were not sustainable. And the wholesale price increases have now fed directly through to consumers. And that's why we're seeing a lot of countries in Europe introducing price caps on the billing companies. So they're telling these companies, you can't charge more than a certain amount because it's just going to drive inflation through the roof. So aside from the companies that have gone bust, the ones who are still trading have supply contracts with the bigger entities. And because they don't have sufficient capital to be able to pay for all of the electricity and gas up front, they take some of it on credit. But the companies who are providing that electricity and gas want some form of security. They want to know that in the event that that billing company goes bankrupt, they will have some capital in order to recoup some of the energy costs that they've already provided. So this is the concept of margin calls. So margin calls is a concept that was set up originally when talking about trading stocks and shares. So brokers offered clients margin accounts. And basically what that meant is that you didn't have to pay for 100% of all of the stocks that you wanted to buy up front. So you could borrow some money from the stockbroker in order to increase the amount of shares you bought. So let's take the example of Apple shares. You go to your broker and say, I would like to buy as many Apple shares as I can because I think the share price of Apple is going to increase dramatically. So you give your broker $15,000 and the broker may set you up with a facility for $20,000. So they take your $15,000, but they allow you credit of $5,000. The broker then goes into the market and purchases $20,000 worth of shares. So in your account, you now have $20,000 worth of Apple shares, and it's only cost you $15,000 of cash plus a $5,000 loan. Now, if the price of those Apple shares goes up, that's great. You can pay off the $5,000 loan and you make all of the profit. However, if the price of those shares goes down and the total value of those Apple shares drops to $12,000, Your broker is then sitting with a $5,000 loan against shares that are worth $12,000. But the terms and conditions of the margin loan may state that you need to cover the amount of that loan at least 3 times with the value of that stock. So in that situation, if the loan is $5,000 and the value of the Apple shares drops to $12,000, you've dropped below that 3 times coverage. So you may then get a call from the broker saying you need to add another $3,000 to the account to take the total value up to $15,000 and give the broker its 3 times coverage. So that's essentially the concept that we're looking at for margin calls. I've obviously simplified it massively. So if you're a stockbroker or somebody who's dealing with all of these things on a daily basis, please don't send me a detailed comment saying you've got it wrong, this is how it works. I know how it works, but this is a simple explanation. So if we now apply this concept to the energy markets, what we've got is a lot of small companies who are taking a lot of energy products from the big boys on credit because they don't have enough cash to be able to pay in advance for all of that gas and electricity. So they're signing agreements saying, please keep supplying all of these consumers. We will bill those consumers. And when we get the money from those consumers on their monthly or quarterly payment dates, we will then pay all of the money we owe to you. So essentially the big players in the market are providing credit to all of the smaller players in order to enable the market to continue operating as it's been structured. But in terms of risk management and to make sure that the big players don't lose huge amounts of money if the small entities go bust, they have the same concept of margin calls. So they're holding money on deposit from all of these smaller players in partial security of the payments that are due for the electricity and gas that's being provided. And the statement that we've just seen from the Norwegian business Equinor estimates that the increase in the margin calls as a direct result of the increase in gas prices and electricity prices caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine equates to over $1.5 trillion for the whole of Europe. Now that is a huge amount of money. $1 trillion is $1,000 billion. So this is a mind-bending sum. So in order to get a better understanding as to why these margin calls have increased so dramatically, let's have a look at what's been happening to prices. The two most widely used forms of energy in Europe are gas and coal. Historically, most of the power plants were coal-driven, but because of the backlash with regards to emissions, a lot of countries have been reducing their exposure to coal, and many of them moved towards gas because gas was cleaner, cheaper and more efficient in producing electricity than coal had been. So over the last 30 years or so, we've seen a huge increase in the number of gas-fired power stations in Europe. Now, each country in Europe has a completely different mix in terms of how it produces its electricity, but there is still a huge amount of exposure to both gas and coal. This chart shows the movement in the price of gas in Europe over the last 12 months. And this shows that this time last year, a unit of gas was trading for around 53 euros. That same unit of gas today is trading for more than 200 euros. So we've seen a 400% increase in the cost of gas over the last 12 months. And you can see from this chart that following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, prices spiked above 200 euros. They then came back down as everybody hoped that the conflict would be over quickly and that a sensible agreement between Europe and Russia would be signed with regards to ongoing provision of gas. However, after President Putin's demand that all future gas payments be made in rubles, a number of countries had their supplies cut off, and we've seen a huge reduction in the provision of gas through the Nord Stream and other pipelines, and that has really driven up the price of gas dramatically. So looking at this chart, you can start to get a feel as to why there are so many problems for the smaller enterprises in the provision of gas. Because as the wholesale price of gas has increased, that's meant that the payments that they've had to make to the bigger suppliers have also increased. So it's putting a massive amount of cash flow strain on all of these businesses. And I think it's really interesting to look at how things have changed over the last 5 years. And you can see that prior to the COVID pandemic, the price of gas was actually trading for significantly less than 50 euros. And at one stage in 2020, it was below 10 euros. So at that point, a lot of the smaller enterprises in the market were able to keep offering fixed price deals to all of their consumers because the price of gas was coming down. So they were actually making profit. They were doing a fixed price deal. The wholesale prices were falling and they were making super profits. The problem that all of those companies had was as the price started to take off, they were left exposed. And as I mentioned earlier, many of them have disappeared. They went bust. And the ones who've survived have had to find more and more cash in order to keep trading. This chart shows the movement in the price of coal over the last 12 months. You can see that this time last year, a unit of coal was trading for around $175. That same unit today is trading for over $440. So that represents a 250% increase in price. And the price movements have followed a similar pattern to gas. We saw a big increase after the start of the invasion. Prices did fall back briefly, but since the start of April, we have seen a steady growth in the price of coal. And once again, I think it's interesting to look at what's happened to the price of coal over the last 5 years. And it's a very similar story. In 2019 and 2020, a unit of coal was trading for less than $100. So when you compare that price to where we are today, that represents a 400% increase. And this is again why a lot of small companies have gone bust and come under a lot of pressure, because they just simply haven't been able to cope with the massive increase in prices, which has led to a massive increase in financial requirements to keep funding their businesses. So what's the impact of all of this on Europe and the European economy? Well, the whole point of deregulation in the market was to increase competition. Bringing in more players and smaller entities meant there was more choice for consumers and better deals were tabled. And the profit margins in the industry were very thin at one point because it was so competitive. So it was great to be a consumer. You could switch your deal on a regular basis. However, since the start of the Ukraine war, those days are long gone. A lot of the small companies who were operating on wafer-thin margins have disappeared. They went bust very quickly. But even the bigger companies are now struggling to make ends meet. Because if you're a middleman in this game, if you're having to purchase wholesale electricity and gas and then make a profit, the problem you've got is when the market prices are constantly increasing, you just can't keep pace because you're having to buy in more gas and electricity at higher prices than what you agreed to supply it to consumers for. So fixed rate deals have disappeared, or if you do get one, then the prices will be astronomically high because all of the companies will now be factoring in more price rises in the future. So for consumers, this is really bad news. All the good deals have disappeared, and in most of the European countries right now, everybody's depending on the price caps that are being set by the governments. So the governments are telling billing companies you're not allowed to charge more than a certain amount, and that's the only protection in the market. So from a consumer's point of view, it's really bad news what's happened because there are no longer any good deals in the market. Everybody is having to move with the market rates. And because we've seen an increase of around 400% in gas and coal prices, that's feeding directly through into electricity. So this is a disaster for consumers, and this is one of the reasons why inflation is so high all across Europe right now, because energy costs firstly feed into inflation, but of course energy costs feed into the cost of everything because all companies need to use some form of energy in their production, and then you've got transportation costs, and because gasoline prices have gone up so much, they've also fed through into higher costs. So the cost of everything is being driven up. So overall, it's really bad news for Europe and the European economy. And of course, that's bad news for the global economy because Europe is a big buyer, so it's a big purchaser of goods from all of the other countries around the world. And if Europe starts to get into difficulty, then that means that there'll be a reduction in demand, and that will equal a global slowdown. So the overall summary on all of this is that the increase in coal and gas prices has led to real problems in the supply chains in all of the countries in Europe, which is putting more pressure on household budgets and is extremely likely to lead to a massive European recession. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because there's been some comments made recently that I'm only posting videos about Russia and China and the negative impacts on their economies from the Ukraine war. But obviously there are negative impacts for everybody, and Europe is at the heart of what's going on here. Because Europe became so dependent on Russian gas over the last 10 or 20 years, it suffered the most, and we have seen a massive increase in energy costs all across Europe. and it's affecting everybody, but particularly the industry that had grown up around the deregulation. A lot of small enterprises, a lot of people were employed in this sector. And for a period of time, they were halcyon days. There was a lot of money to be made, and it was good news for consumers as well because you were getting the best deal. There were lots of options. You could go onto all the comparison sites, find the best deal, switch your supplier. It would happen in a matter of days, and then you would pay less for your gas and electricity. So this was all good news. But what's happened since Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that the wholesale prices of coal and gas have increased dramatically. And because Europe is still dependent on both of those sources of energy for the production of electricity, that's meant a massive increase in energy costs for everybody. So we've seen a huge fallout in the energy sector. Lots and lots of companies have disappeared, gone bankrupt, people have been made redundant, they've lost their jobs. So this is obviously really bad news. And the financial structure that's been built into the industry is really dependent on a lot of leverage. So a lot of the smaller companies are dependent upon credit being provided to them by the bigger players in order to keep the supplies flowing. And comments have been made in the press recently that the financial structure and the derivatives and the margin calls could equate to what we saw back in 2008 with the global financial crisis. And if you remember back to what happened, there were a lot of really complicated financial structures that were put in place by some of the investment banks, CDOs, CLOs, lots of derivative products. And what happened was when one company went bust, there was a big domino effect. So we saw banks such as Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers actually disappearing. They went bankrupt. They went out of business. And that caused a huge contraction in liquidity. And that was one of the big issues from the global financial crisis, was that nobody could get access to any credit. All of the banks were going bust, and therefore there was nobody to do any lending, and that's why it had such a severe impact on the global economy. And so there's been some comments recently that we could see a similar thing in the energy market. Because the energy market has been built on this concept of credit and margin calls, if we start seeing some of these entities going bust, that could have the same domino impact that we saw from the global financial crisis. And I guess the only answer to that is we'll have to wait and see what happens. At the moment, the governments are stepping in. We're hearing things like Uniper in Germany, where the German authorities have had to come in and provide a bailout. And it may be that we see wide-scale bailouts of the energy sector over the next 6 to 12 months because they can't allow these companies to disappear because everybody needs to have that gas and electricity. It needs to keep flowing. So you can't allow the companies who own all of the assets to actually go bankrupt. You have to step in. So there are some comparables to what happened back in 2008 when a lot of governments had to bail out their banks because they needed those banks to keep supplying credit, for keep the mortgage market moving, to keep the housing market moving, to keep the economy moving. So there are some real comparables here that the governments may feel obliged to step in and bail out these companies if they do get to the point where they're becoming bankrupt, because they are essentially needed going forward. So the reason that a lot of these companies were national entities originally is because it was the best way of structuring it. We've seen a lot of deregulation, so they've become privatized. But there is a possibility that we could see some of these entities being renationalised, being taken over by the governments, being bailed out, because there's no real other option. You have to keep the lights on and the gas flowing. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode. You've found it interesting, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already.